Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus Van Staden of Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. Very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, it's the first show of the new year, January 2017, and it's the month that a lot of us, well, some of us, not all of us, have been waiting for, because, of course, this is the month on January 20th, 2017, that Donald J. Trump will be inaugurated President of the United States. It's hard to imagine that this is where it's come to, but it's brought us to a very important milestone in American history and America's relationship with the world, because what we've seen in the run-up from the election to his taking office very soon, imminently, is really a challenge to the international order, and that will have profound impact on not only the United States' relationship in Africa, but also the relationship between and among the United States, Africa, and China. And I just think it's going to be absolutely fascinating, because as much as we want to think we know what's going to happen, we absolutely have no idea.
One of the complications of China-Africa life and the China-Africa relationship is that China and the U.S. have, to a large extent, kind of defined themselves in Africa in comparison to each other. So, kind of the U.S. has defined itself over the Obama administration, definitely, as the non-China. And China has defined itself as being different from the U.S. in lots of different ways. And both of them have tried to use that difference to appeal to Africa in complicated ways. Now, I think the difference is all up in the air. And we're not really sure what the difference between the two are going to be and how they're going to define their roles in the future.
Yeah, it's really absolutely fascinating. So today what we wanted to do is try to get the view from Washington about the U.S.-China-Africa relationship and how the changing relationship between the United States and China will impact Africa as well. And we're just so thrilled that to have our guest today back again for the second time on our show, but it's very special this particular time. For those of you who don't know Janet Ohm, she is the research manager at the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University. She works alongside Deborah Browdegem. Many of you may know her. CARI is probably one of the most well-known research groups in the China-Africa space. But Janet is really very special in other ways as well, in part because she was one of a very select few this year who has won a Schwarzman Scholarship. And for those of you not familiar with the Schwarzman Scholarship, it really is the equivalent to the Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford in the United Kingdom. And it is one of the most prestigious scholarships to get. It's at, I think, Tsinghua University in Beijing. It is incredibly difficult, very, very competitive. And Janet will be going there in August. Congratulations, Mazel Tov, Gongxi, all the different ways to say, congratulations on the Schwarzman.
Thank you so much, Eric.
It's really a pleasure to have you back on the show. And in part, the reason why we are so excited is because you're in Washington, D.C. now. You have been watching the political events unfold over the past 18 months that have led up to Donald Trump taking office this very soon in a few short days on January 20th. You also have time that you've spent in East Africa. You lived in China
Correct.
For a long time. You were at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center there. You're going back to China. So in many ways, you are the perfect person to kind of talk to us about how you see the relationship among these three regions changing in this new uncertain era. What are your thoughts that that have been going through you, and as you talk to Professor Browdegem, what's the narrative here that you're trying to put together?
Right. Well, it's interesting that you say, my time in these various places at these very, very quickly changing times. And I definitely think that there could be some drastic changes. I think the main thing is that up until now, back in 2009, when the trade China surpassed the U.S. as Africa's top trade partner, I think that was kind of a pivoting point in terms of a lot of people in Washington starting to pay attention to China-Africa relations. And since then, there's definitely been a narrative that's been built up where, distinguishing U.S. foreign policy in Africa from the Chinese way of doing things. And a lot of the time, China distinguishing itself based on its non-interference, right? And the U.S. Espousing more of these conditions when it engages economically. So I think definitely that narrative could change a bit. I think the main question is just how much that will change. a lot of people here right now in Washington, there's still so much speculation leading up to January 20th in terms of exactly what the new administration will look like, just in terms of its domestic policy and then, of course, its foreign policy. And so just the degree to which this might shift and what that would mean for Africans, I think that's still something we can debate. So I think we'll have to see.
One of the themes that have come up during the campaigns have been hostility towards China as a trading partner, and a lot of criticism about kind of the impact of trade with China and outsourcing to China on the American workforce. And there's been talk of tariffs. There's been talk of a possible trade war. If the trade relationship between China and the U.S. becomes more tense, what do you think some of the fallout will be on Africa?
So any trade war that China brings, or that the U.S. brings on China, will definitely bring in Africa too. The main reason is that the U.S. is not China's only export destination. Today, China exports to African consumers mostly manufactured products, machinery, electronics, automobiles, textiles. So China already has been engaging with a lot of African markets. And so I think, if anything, if the U.S. decides to raise tariffs on Chinese goods coming in, China will have even more of an interest in investing in growing markets in Africa, facilitating that growing middle class across a lot of African countries so that its trade with Africa can continue. Some estimates say the continent's middle class is up to 34% of the population. That's definitely significant. And so I think that in that way, maybe even some of these African countries will benefit in terms of some of the tensions between U.S. and China in terms of trade.
Yeah, but you can't kind of equate the rising African middle class with the, even as beleaguered as the American middle class is, it's still significantly wealthier than the African middle class. So any downturn in U.S. trade probably can't be made up by African consumers.
I think that's true that it can't be made up, but I think just exactly because of that, I think there might be more of a deliberate action on the part of some of these our Chinese counterparts in terms of wanting to make sure that those markets stay open for Chinese exports in Africa.
There's been a lot of talk about how Chinese companies are using Africa as a backdoor into the United States because of AGOA, which is the African Growth and Opportunity Act. So AGOA allows for free trade access from Africa into the U.S. market. And there's been some criticism in Africa that Chinese companies are starting to use this. And I can imagine in a scenario, if Trump puts tariffs on Chinese products made in China, and if all of a sudden, Ethiopia becomes a shoe manufacturing destination as it is, that they could take advantage of AGOA and just shift some of the production there. And, it would be hard, I think, politically for Trump to shut down trade with Africa because of Chinese products. Do you ever, you and your colleagues at CARI kind of think about that scenario about how AGOA could be leveraged by the Chinese to get around any potential trade sanctions?
Right. I mean, it's interesting to say that. I just want to bring up one thing. You were talking about shoe manufacturing in Ethiopia. A lot of the, discussions around China in the past, 18 months, like you said, have been focused on this idea that a lot of U.S. manufacturing jobs have moved to China due to lower wages. But now a lot of those jobs are offshoring from China to Africa as wages rise in China. So a lot of the Huajian shoe factory in Ethiopia, for example, is one example of that. And actually, Ivanka Trump's apparel line, which is manufactured in China, there have actually been some headlines, some speculation that there were talks of it moving to Africa because of the lower wages. So, that's like one interesting spin on this. In terms of AGOA, I think it's a little harder to say because definitely a lot of the discussions around trade, this more protectionist view on trade. And so I'm not too optimistic that AGOA may stay at the same rate that it has. It may take a hit. And so I think it's still uncertain, and it would be in our interest, but I think we have to wait and see what the administration decides.
One of the complications, I think, of the coming Trump administration is that he sits on such a complicated kind of Republican base, kind of where there's so many different Republican constituencies are part of his base. including, kind of some support from evangelical groups, some strong, strong kind of presence from the extraction industries in his cabinet. How do you see these different groupings? Who, a lot of them have some kind of leg in Africa. The evangelicals have strong engagement in Africa. The extractionists have a strong engagement in Africa. How do you see those kind of power bases pulling his approach to Africa?
That's really interesting. I actually didn't think about some of those factions that you just mentioned. It's difficult to say again because I feel like definitely during his presidency, Donald Trump will want to make sure that he keeps those constituents close. But just knowing the structure of a lot of his predecessors, Obama with Power Africa and Bush with PEPFAR, just the way that some of these initiatives have panned out, I just don't know how easy it would be for Donald Trump to change the way things have been working in D.C. for the past 8 years.
Well, he's off to a pretty good start, I got to say. I mean,
Right.
I mean, but, Cobus, let me take a shot at that one because there's been a lot of excitement in some parts of the extractive business in Africa over the appointment of, the current, soon-to-be former head of Exxon as Secretary of State. And, and this idea that maybe that will strengthen, what's been a declining U.S. African oil business, particularly with Nigeria. And the reason why I think that's a false hope is because one of the major constituencies that you raised of the Trump coalition is the domestic extractive business in the United States to get, that drill, baby, drill, which is domestic oil business, the shale business, the North Dakota oil. So I don't necessarily think that that's going to benefit Africa. And that will give, again, more running room, I think, for the Chinese oil majors to operate in Africa because the markets will not be in the United States as they've been, because I think that he really wants to start, do what he calls the America First principle, which is to first build a domestic oil industry to kind of, with oil prices down where they are, it's become unprofitable for most American shale drilling to go on. But now I think he wants to focus on that, and he's not going to focus on African extractive industries, which has been the bedrock of the U.S.-African trade relationship.
Right, and I think another aspect...
Go ahead, sorry.
Go ahead, Janet.
Oh, no, I was just going to say another aspect of that is, for example, Power Africa emphasizes clean energy. A lot of those initiatives under Power Africa. So given his stance on climate change and a lot of the people that he's picking for his cabinet in terms of some of these energy policies, I think definitely it's unlikely that Power Africa in particular may continue in the way it has.
Kind of mentioning Power Africa, it was an interesting kind of hallmark of the Obama administration to link progressive political causes with development. There has been these kind of dust-ups, especially in East Africa, where there's, there were the pipeline for development finance. There was some kind of interruptions there because of human rights issues. And particularly one issue that I think drew a lot of press in Africa was the focus on LGBT rights coming from the Obama administration. And in a lot of ways, China have been defining themselves against that kind of approach in the US by like playing up their non-intervention policy, saying like we're only interested in financing infrastructure. We're not interested in dictating kind of local policy. How do you see that kind of linking of development and human rights continuing under Trump? I mean, I'm not particularly optimistic about that approach in the future.
Right. Well, definitely Trump's campaign drew a lot of attention for what a lot of people saw as regressive views on human rights domestically. So if there's a drawback to some of these issues in the U.S., I think it'd be naive to think that wouldn't happen abroad as well in terms of how we engage with certain African countries.
Cobus, one area where, you talked about LGBT issues, Trump has actually been quite progressive. I mean, he was way ahead of the pack to not make, gay issues, that big of a deal. And, now.
But then his appointments were horrific. Mike Pence alone is
Mike Pence is a nightmare for LGBT, but, he's the president. Mike Pence isn't, as far as we know. So you may not see that the LGBT issues, rise to the top the same way it did under a Bush administration, which was openly evangelical. It may just be a non-issue. And in that case, President Kenyatta, who really resented Obama kind of commenting on gay rights in Kenya, or certainly in Uganda where that's an issue, they just, maybe just it falls off the agenda.
Well, LGBT issues became a kind of a flashpoint in this particular thing because I think African elites assumed that they could effectively count on homophobia within Africa. They could effectively make that like, oh, look at these outrageous demands that are being put on us by the West. Where our very bedrock of our culture is being threatened. Et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But it also went not only LGBT rights but also issues in relation to the free press, civil society, women's rights and so on. The Obama administration linked all of those to development.
Well, I hope for one that Trump does continue to kind of raise the issues of LGBT issues, particularly in places like Uganda and Kenya. But it's hard to tell. Go ahead, Janet. Let us know what you think.
Sure. I think you guys both raised a lot of good points just now. And I think that's the main thing is that in terms of how any change in U.S. policy towards these African countries, I think definitely the Chinese reaction so far has been the U.S. is hypocritical, that yes, they talk about human rights in Africa and, there has been push for LGBT rights or women's rights, these kind of things. But now I think there'll be even more of an incentive for Chinese counterparts to say, oh, those things aren't going so well in the U.S. So, that kind of hypocrisy definitely may weaken the U.S.'s soft power or when it espouses these values in various African countries, it weakens their stance.
For those of you who don't live in Washington, D.C., one of the kind of, industry rags, the newspapers, is called The Hill. And it's a paper that everybody on Capitol Hill reads, and it's kind of an inside the Beltway type of publication. And over the past couple months, since the election, there have been at least 2 columns that I've seen, maybe more, arguing for Donald Trump to engage Africa as a way to check China's power around the world. That this is a front in almost the war against China or the coming war against China, that Africa is a front. And the way I see it is that, these are kind of some of the African lobbyists who want to make sure that the United States doesn't retreat ttoo much. So they're picking on the boogeyman that they think will generate the most attention. This is kind of like saying, let's fight communism in Central America. And that's all of a sudden, all of the White House goes, oh, no, we can't have communism in Central America. And then they, in the 1980s, they throw everything down towards it. So I'm wondering if you think that there will be this movement to engage China in other parts of the world, whether it's in the Middle East or Africa, and if you think that will actually get any traction in Washington.
So you mean who's trying to engage?
So that is for the United States to engage, the Chinese in Africa as a way to stay engaged in Africa, to stop the forward momentum of China in Africa.
Interesting. I'm not quite sure if I have a definite answer to that question, but I do think that until now there has been such a a lot of the talk has been around the stark difference between the U.S. and China in terms of how they engage with the rest of the world. But I think that actually there might be some kind of room for a convergence now. Like I said, a lot of these African countries, I think, will start to see that a lot of the concerns they had about China in terms of poor environmental degradation or not respecting local human rights laws, et cetera, those kind of things are still issues in the U.S. as well, from the U.S. side as well. So I think that there might actually be, in the view of some of these African countries, this idea that there's a convergence. There isn't such a stark difference between the two models anymore. And maybe that will provide room for some kind of more localized hybrid models of development where these African countries say, oh, we have this way of doing things on our own, and now we're going to engage. We're going to have a little bit more agency in terms of how we decide to engage with China and the U.S. respectively.
On a slightly wider view, one of the powers of the U.S. over the decades has always been to inspire. Kind of its big narrative has always been a narrative of hope. And not only hope for people to move to the US and live the American dream, but also this kind of idea that if you follow a basic kind of US model of kind of combo of development and capitalism and human rights together, then kind of there is a way to reach this American kind of modernity. Now it seems that China has a kind of a counter narrative which includes these kind of sweeping developments like One Belt, One Road. Like, how do you see the Trump administration kind of affecting the narrative of the US in Africa compared to China's?
I think that definitely there's, in terms of One Belt, One Road, there's also other initiatives such as a lot of African students now being able to study in China on various scholarships, or Confucius Institutes across African countries. So I think that in terms of, there's definitely been a deliberate measure on the Chinese side in terms of this model of development and how to engage Africans in that. I think that, I don't know if there's going to be some kind of narrative that's going to change. Again, I think that it will kind of push some African countries towards China a little bit more just because of this idea of American hypocrisy. I think that's kind of the biggest narrative that would come out of this.
Maybe, Cobus, we've been looking at this the wrong way, though. Maybe, let me just play devil's advocate here. That the United States, Trump, for all his flaws that you and I clearly share, and I'm assuming other people believe this as well. Janet, I won't speak for you, but I assume that that's where you kind of land. But one of the things that he says is that America's a mess. We shouldn't be bothering other people. We got to get our own house in order first. And maybe we'll stop with the preaching on human rights. And when Hillary Clinton and Johnny Carson, the former Assistant Secretary of State, used to go over to Africa and used to rail against the Chinese, implying that the Americans were the better partner. And maybe that moralism will stop under Trump. Maybe. I'm just projecting here. And what we're seeing in the United States is the fusion of corporate power and state power, which, of course, is the Chinese model in many ways. And so we might see Exxon and the U.S. government partner up even more than they already do, and just the same way that, CNOOC, the Chinese national oil company, partners up with the state because it's a state entity, and they go abroad. And in some ways, there may be a convergence of how we do things in this world. I'm just putting it out there, Cobus, as that it may not all be this nightmarish, horrific type of story, that the United States retreating from kind of meddling in other countries' affairs and kind of preaching down to people, telling them what they're doing wrong. I mean, for me, the irony, I live in a communist authoritarian country. And when the United States kind of lectures Vietnamese on human rights, and, a lot of my workers turn around and go like, well, wait a minute, you have a quarter of the world's prisoners. You have 15, 20 people in jail cells that are meant for 4. You have homeless people all over San Francisco, LA, and New York. I mean, there are clear human rights violations in the United States. And I think Trump in some ways is speaking to that to say we need to take care of America first before we start lecturing to the other parts of the world. Cobus, do you think there's a scenario where actually things get better because this moralism may actually be put to the side for a change?
There's this kind of preaching about human rights frequently gets very bad press in Africa, and it is frequently seen as part of some kind of like expansionist agenda by the US. So I can well imagine that, kind of that retreating from that, kind of might well ease relationships between Africa and the US. However, I don't necessarily see that would necessarily improve life in Africa. I can see that it might well, kind of create kind of comfort zones for people, for authoritarian rulers. It's a very difficult question for me to answer. What I do think is that in lots of ways, Africa should not be ignored by Americans as, kind of as examples of certain tendencies that are becoming apparent in the US. One is this kind of tendency both to fuse corporate and state power, for corporates to kind of infiltrate the architecture of the state, and then also for presidential family members to take on important kind of dual corporate and policy roles. Africa has a lot to teach there, and not a lot of it is very optimistic.
Janet, let's close our discussion. You are going in 2017 to Beijing. You've been at the China-Africa Research Institute. You've been keeping an eye on what's happening in Africa. When you get to China later this year in August to start your Schwarzman Scholarship, what are you going to be thinking about in terms of the U.S.-China-Africa relationship now that you're going to be looking at it from the point of view from this side of the world?
I think about this quite often, actually. It'll definitely be an interesting time to be there. I think I'm most interested in when I go to China, I'll be there for at least 1 year. I just think it'll be refreshing to see how all of this is panning out from Beijing, both in terms of American expats that are there and what some of their views might be, but also exactly, Chinese academics or maybe some of my Chinese classmates at Tsinghua, some who may have spent some time in the U.S. studying, for example. I think I just want to kind of understand what their views are, since I will be there. And, I'll continue to think a little bit more about what this tension might mean for the next administration might mean for U.S.-China relations elsewhere, for example, in Africa.
Well, we can't wait to talk with you once you're in Beijing, because I think we'll get a very different story at that point. And we will be 6 or 7 months into the Trump presidency by that time, so we may have an indication of which direction things are going. Doesn't that sound scary?
Right.
6 or 7 months into the Trump presidency?
We'll see how quickly our predictions during this podcast have changed.
It's terrifying. Janet Ohm is the research manager at the China-Africa Research Initiative at the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Soon to be departing from Johns Hopkins to go to Beijing to Tsinghua University, where she is recently awarded a Schwarzman Scholarship. And we are just thrilled to have you back on the show and cannot wait to talk with you later in the year when you are in Beijing. Congratulations again on the Schwarzman. It's a tremendous accomplishment.
Thank you so much, Cobus and Eric.
For Cobus Van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show, or follow China Africa News that's updated every 4 hours, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadenesque or Eric at Olander. That's EOLANDER. Subscribe to the China Africa podcast on iTunes or download the mobile apps for iOS, Android, or Windows Phone. Just head over to your favorite store and search for China Africa.